Butcherface Part 1. In 1997, my friend, who we'll call Chris, moved across state. At that time, we were 10. We didn't really have much of a way to see each other besides getting a ride by our parents to one or the other's house, which would be a hassle for our parents, so we eventually lost contact. During this time, I had only gotten the chance to visit his house once. With this story being in this subreddit, you'd expect the house to be creepy, but it really wasn't. It was a very plain split-level house probably built in the early 80s with neighbors close by, so it wasn't even secluded. Like I said, we lost contact with each other for 10 years. That is until Chris contacted a mutual friend through MySpace. I didn't have an account on that site. We made plans to hook up and hang out. Now that we have our own means of transportation, it was a lot easier. After maybe a month of this, Chris mentioned that his family will be remodeling the house and I offered my help. Him and his father gladly accepted the offer since the previous owners apparently didn't keep up on it themselves. So, a couple weeks later, I drive down one weekend and we start tearing up carpeting, ripping off wallpaper, etc. The basement had been changed into a room for Chris some years before, and while half of the floor was concrete, the other half seemed to have been torn up and replaced with floorboards, and one of the boards had become warped and broke, leaving it protruding up under the carpet, so they wanted to replace it. We tore the carpet up and started ripping out the floorboards when we found what looked like a hole dug about 5 feet into the ground under the floor. Chris jumped down there thinking he could get better leverage to tear up the boards when he said something was down there. His father got a flashlight and we jumped down to check it out. It turned out to be a very worn box. It looked similar to a shoebox, but it was about 3 feet long and extremely damaged by the elements. It was so tattered that you wouldn't be able to pick it up in one piece. We believed that whatever was in it would be just as damaged, but when we ripped it open, we noticed that whatever was in it had the added protection of a black trash bag. Chris picked up the trash bag and its contents made the sound of plastic hitting plastic. We were curious as to what's in there, so we brought it upstairs and cut the bag open with a pair of scissors and found 24 unmarked videotapes. Me and Chris were curious as to what was on them, but his father claimed that they were most likely somebody's old bootleg collection, and if we're still curious, we should check them out later after we were done for the day. Since the plan was for me to stay the night and help them out the next day and leave that Sunday night, we decided to watch them that night. Since Chris's father was tired and didn't really care what was on the tapes, he went to bed a little bit early that night. So, we pulled their old VCR from their attic, hooked it up to the TV in Chris's room and took one of the tapes out of the bag and slipped it in. The tapes certainly weren't bootlegged movies like Chris's father believed. They were the home movies of an unknown man we eventually began to call Butcherface. There was seemingly no flow from one scene to the next. It was like he would just film something random for what was usually just a couple minutes, then put the camera away for God knows how long, until he found something else that interested him. Most of the footage was random footage like him turning on the camera, facing a chair. He would walk out from behind the camera to the chair, push it over onto the floor, walk back to the camera and turn it off. Or him playing with a random spider, which he would talk to in a low, childlike voice, then end the tape with him squashing it. Or him just filming down at his feet as he walks while deeply breathing. The one thing that always stuck out about all the footage is that on the few times that his face was shown, he was seen wearing what looked like a burlap sack tightly tied around his head with twine with 2 eye holes cut out. He was also a big guy, being easily over 6 feet tall with a decent build, with some muscles, but not being buff. A lot of the footage was a lot more creepy and sinister. Some of the footage was of him videotaping people leaving buildings and houses. He was obviously hiding somewhere across the street from these locations, and he was often breathing loudly. Even worse were the things he videotaped himself doing. One piece of footage showed him sitting at a table, with a rat trapped in an empty large pickle jar. He unscrewed the pickle jar, took the rat out, slowly put his hand on its head and started twisting until it stopped screaming. He twisted a little more until its head was completely ripped off the body. Then he turned the camera off. Another clip showed him in a barn, which there was no barn on my friend's property, so we don't know where this was filmed. He turned the camera on, showing a pig tied to a post. He walked over to the pig with an axe in his hand and hacked its head off. What was really creepy was that most of the footage was shot in what was now my friend's house. It was always dark in the footage, like this man didn't like to have lights on, but we did recognize various locations of the house. One piece of footage was obviously shot in the living room, which showed Butcherface using a large hunting knife to cut the power cord off of something we couldn't see, wrapping this cord tightly around his arm, grunting and moaning as he does it, and using the knife to cut deep cuts into his hand and arm. One disturbing clip showed him standing in front of a table in the kitchen. On the table was a clothes iron. He then unzipped his pants, took out his penis, put it on the table and pressed the hot iron against it. He screamed but didn't take it off for about 30 seconds. He finally took it off, limped over to the camera and turned it off. What freaked us out the most was a clip of Butcherface in what used to be Chris's upstairs bedroom before he moved to the basement. He turned the camera on and showed the whole room covered in what appeared to be hundreds of lit candles. They were on every table, chair, and shelf. The walls were covered in paintings of grotesque and ghostly faces. He then walked to a corner of the room and started furiously carving something into the floor with the hunting knife. He would stab it into the floor and drag it around, pull it out and stab again. Since that room was vacant at the moment and used for storage and was going to be renovated anyway, Chris's father let us tear up the carpet in that area of the room. What we found was a section of the floor that had been heavily sanded down with no real evidence of what had been carved there. Another tape showed footage of Butcherface in that same room with even more candles. He was on his knees, facing away from the camera, with his arms in the air, screaming to be brought to the pits of pain and torture. One interesting thing about this clip is that he only had 3 fingers on his left hand, missing his pinky and ring finger. He had all 5 fingers in the previous clips, and we think he cut them off. That was the last clip of that tape, and the camera appeared to run out of tape. The last piece of footage on the last tape showed Butcherface furiously digging the hole that we found in the basement. He was digging fast and breathing heavily. He was constantly grunting. His shirt was off, but he still had the mask on. After a couple minutes of him just digging, he started talking, saying something like, "This is it. This is it. They won't know. They'll never find me. This is where I'll hide." About 2 weeks after we found the Butcherface tapes, we were getting tired with having to lug the VCR up and down those steep attic steps because Chris's father, for some reason, kept asking us to put it back up there when we weren't using it, when Chris's younger brother, let's call him Evan, who was going to college for media production, came into the middle of a conversation about this and mentioned that he could convert the tapes to DVD using equipment at his college. After some haggling and way too much negotiating, that if we, being newly 21 at the time, would pay for the liquor bill for a party that friends of Evan's were having, who were 19 at the time, he'd do it the next day. When that day came, both me and Chris were waiting anxiously in the kitchen for when Evan got home. When he finally walked in the door, an hour later than he said he'd be back, he was looking extremely pale. We asked him if he was done converting, and he jumped in our faces saying that we never told him what was on the tapes. Apparently, he didn't actually hear what we were talking about, and only heard that we wanted some tapes converted, and he thought they were more like old family recordings like Christmas or birthday videos. We calmed him down and asked him if he converted the tapes. He said no, and quickly left the room. We were disappointed and started talking about what to do next when Evan came back into the room with his father behind him. After talking about what was on the tapes, Evan retrieved them from his car, and the 4 of us watched every one of the 24 tapes together. After the last tape was finished, "This is it. This is it. They won't know. They'll never find me. This is where I'll hide." Chris's father's face was just as pale as Evan's was earlier. He leaned back in his chair and said, "That was creepy." An hour of talking that night ended with us wanting to know who was on the tapes. I left for home soon after with the understanding that I would be kept in the loop on what we would do next. which was to figure out the previous owners of the house. A couple days later from there, I got a phone call from Chris saying that it took them a little while. They found nothing on the county website, but they found some history on the house at the town library on something called a reverse directory about a previous owner who had it in the mid-80s. After a few unanswered phone calls, we decided to visit these people in person. So that Friday, me, Chris, and his father drove to their house and knocked on the door, only to be greeted by two 80-something-year-old women. Chris's father told them that his family was living in their old house and asked if we could ask them some questions about it. They refused to let us in their house, but they did tell us about the house. It turned out that the both of them were sisters. Their first names were Shirley and Louise turned out to be the former owner of the house, but never lived in it. Apparently, her and her husband bought the house and were planning to add some new wiring and plumbing before moving in, but her husband had a severe stroke not too long after buying it and eventually died. With the combination of hospital and funerary bills, Louise couldn't afford fixing up and moving into the house and moved in with her sister instead. But she did mention that during that time, the house was known to be home to a fair number of homeless people who would be regularly chased off the property. We also asked if either of them had a son, and they both said no. We left there with not too many answers. A couple weeks later from there, me and Chris had gone to the movies with his girlfriend. I think he was trying to get his mind off the tapes because I could tell that he was still creeped out. We were talking about how much the movie sucked, Spider-Man 3, when Chris slammed on the brakes. We practically skidded about 30 feet, and I was choked by my seatbelt, and his girlfriend, who wasn't wearing a seatbelt, was almost thrown into the front seat. We started screaming at him, asking him what the hell he was doing when we looked at what he was staring at and saw a house. It looked familiar to me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I looked back to Chris and he said, "That house is on the tapes." Then I remembered one of the houses that Butcherface had watched people come and go from was right there, not 20 feet from us. We knocked on the door, but no one answered, so we decided to come back later. When we got back to Chris's house, I noticed the VCR hooked back up to Chris's TV in his room. I asked him about it, and he said he'd been watching the tapes again for any clues. No wonder why he was still creeped out. That night, when I got home, I got a phone call from Chris. He was whispering and said that he thinks he saw someone walking around his backyard. 2 days later, that Friday, I agreed to sleep over and see for myself. Chris was claiming to see glimpses of someone standing or walking around in his backyard, but it was always too dark to see any detail, both of the previous nights. I was set up to sleep on a couch that was on the now reboarded up hole we first found the tapes in. Very little sleeping actually went on that night because we stayed up in the living room, staring out the sliding glass door to the backyard. We were talking about how we weren't even sure if he actually hurts people when Chris suddenly leans forward and points out the window and said, "See? Right there. Do you see that shadow or something?" I jumped up and flipped the switch to the deck lights, but they didn't go on. So we got flashlights and went out to look. Besides some tree branches blowing in the wind, we found nothing. At around 4 a.m., we decided to get some sleep. I only stayed on the couch a couple hours because I got too cold because I felt a draft that I think was coming between the boards on the floor. I went home the next afternoon thinking the night before was a dud until I got a frantic phone call that night. Someone had broken into Chris's house while they were out. The sliding glass door to the backyard was completely smashed with broken glass, having been thrown all the way across the living room and into the dining room. I drove back there because they wanted me as a witness to seeing a shadow in the backyard. They showed me around and I saw that this person had completely tossed the living room, dining room, and kitchen. In the bathroom, the mirror over the medicine cabinet had been smashed and all the meds in the medicine cabinet were missing. Something else was missing, which was a lot more disconcerting. 4 knives had been removed from the knife holder in the kitchen. I stayed there for about an hour and decided to go home, and it was only when after I left that I realized that the Butcherface tapes was never mentioned to the cops. A little while after I got home, I got another call from Chris saying that they had found the missing knives. under the blankets of each of the family members' beds. That weekend, Chris and his father decided to look around the house more thoroughly to see if Butcherface had left any other clues to his former presence in the house. I came over to help, and the only room they said they've never thoroughly looked around in since getting the house was the attic, so we decided to start there. It didn't take long to find anything because almost immediately, I came across an old-looking trash bag in one of the corners. I picked it up and heard the tinking sound of glass against glass. We brought it downstairs and cut it open and found it completely full of liquor bottles and used syringes. Using rubber gloves, we removed every object one at a time. It was almost all bottles and syringes and the occasional trash until we got to the bottom. At the bottom of the bag, we found a shoebox. It was stained and worn. We couldn't even see the brand of shoe that used to be in it. We carefully took it out and removed the top, which seemed to have been glued closed. Inside was a series of papers and photos. The photos were pretty disturbing. One was a close-up of a hand covered in pins, those ones with the long point with the tiny ball of colored plastic at one end. There were so many of them that it looked like a porcupine. Another one had a, presumably, dead dog lying on the ground. All we could really see of its surroundings was the dirt of the ground. Behind it was too dark. We assume it was dead because it was missing half its face. The flesh of the side of the face that was facing the camera was gone, making it look like it was smiling with a lidless eye. There were a lot more pictures, including a cow with blood on its mouth, a very pale-looking foot, various 70s and 80s era toys, a collection of knives, a hand and arm painted multiple colors like patchwork, and a close-up of an eyeball. The papers were pretty freaky as well. They were a combination of drawings and writings. Most of the writings were what seemed like a wish list of murder, listing practically every way imaginable how to kill people. Others seemed to be random thoughts, like how he accidentally pissed his pants while at the movies, or how he has an infectious evil, and that he'll spread that to his disciples. Some of the drawings were pretty similar to the ones seen on some of the tapes on the walls in Chris's old room. Others were more detailed and showed corpses of various states of decay and of strange creatures. They were humanoid, but they all had a demonic look to them, with many of them shown standing on all fours. One thing that showed up often was a strange symbol. It looked like the letter C with the gap in the C pointing down, with a V laid on top of it. When we got to the bottom of the box, we found another tape, one that we'll never get to watch, because it was completely coated in candle wax. Running out of clues, we decided to revisit the old women who owned the house in the 80s again. It had been almost 2 months since we last visited them, and we grew to realize that their story didn't quite make sense. For instance, Louise claimed to have given up on the house, yet on the tapes we could see that the house had power. Why would she have continued paying the power bill if she didn't want the house? They also mentioned that homeless people had been regularly arrested or chased off the property by the cops, but we found no records of this. We tried calling them, but just like last time, we got no answer, so we decided to drop by again. When we got there, we found the house abandoned. We went next door and asked the neighbor if they knew where the 2 old ladies that lived next door had gone. They told us that Louise had died, but they didn't know how, about 3 weeks earlier, and Shirley abruptly packed up and moved away a week later. While Chris's father was talking to the neighbor, Chris pulled me aside and whispered, "We're breaking into that house." That same night, we waited until it was late and drove to the old lady's former house. We had never broken into a house before in our lives, and we were dressed in the stereotypical burglar outfit, black shirt and pants, and a black hockey mask. I know, stupid. When we got to the house, we were so nervous that we didn't even leave the car for a good 45 minutes. When we felt assured that the neighborhood was asleep, we got out of the car and crept into the backyard and to the back door. We looked into the window on the door, but it was too dark to see anything. I took my shirt off and put it up against the window and gave it a punch, breaking the glass. It felt surprisingly loud, but that could have been because it was so quiet, and the neighbors never woke up, so I guess it really wasn't that loud. I reached in through the hole in the glass and unlatched the door. Then we had a whispered fight over who will go in first. It actually got down to a game of rock, paper, scissors, which I won, so Chris went in first. We crept in, hunched over, and I closed the door behind me, accidentally slamming it, giving Chris a good jump that we couldn't help laughing over. We snuck around the house with our flashlights shining over the walls. As a side note, I really don't see how much they really would have fixed up Chris's house when they had it, because this one looked like crap. The wallpaper was probably older than me and Chris combined. But anyway, we went into the living room and found a huge pile of trash lying in the far corner, with a depression in the middle, like a person or a large dog had used it as a bed. We went upstairs and found something that connected this house to Chris's. In one of the bedrooms was a pile of pill bottles. Some of the pill bottles were the ones stolen from Chris's bathroom medicine cabinet. We knew this because some of them had his mother and father's name on them, and one of them was Chris's back pain medicine from an injury that happened a couple years ago that will require surgery. That was all we needed to see, so we booked it back down the stairs and to the door. But when we got to the door, I jumped back, knocking both me and Chris down. On the inside of the back door was the CV symbol from Butcherface's notes. After we got back to the car, Chris said something that creeped the both of us out. If Butcherface really is living in that house, he probably wasn't there because he was staking out Chris's house right now. Later that week, I visited Chris's house again, and as soon as I walked into the door, I knew I walked into an air of distress. Chris's mother and brother were pacing back and forth in the living room, looking out the window into the backyard. I walked in and asked what was going on and looked out the window and saw Chris and his father in the backyard screaming at each other, and behind them was a large bonfire that was almost nothing more than cinders. Chris's mother said their dog, Brackett, had gone missing, but didn't say anything else. I opened the, now replaced, sliding glass door and walked out to meet them. As soon as Chris's father saw me, he became even angrier. Chris met me halfway to the fire and said I had to tell them that we broke into that house. I asked why, and he said that he thinks that Butcherface took their dog as payback for breaking into his home. I asked what was on the fire, and Chris told me that what his father was burning was Butcherface's notes, photos, and tapes. Everything had been burned to ashes. During this, his father had walked up behind him and said, "I'm ending this right now. I'm burning everything so that you guys can't get into any more trouble." As he said this, he continued past us and into the back door of his garage and came back with a shovel, adding, "And I'm burying the ashes to put this to rest for good," and started digging a hole at the back of his yard close to the woods. Chris pulled me back into the house and started talking about all of this was unfair. How could his father just burn the tapes like that? They were so close to figuring out who Butcherface was, etc. Then his mother called for us from upstairs. We came up and she pointed out the door to his father, who had stopped digging and was looking into the hole he had dug so far. We walked outside and crossed the yard to the hole that his father was still looking into. When we got to it, we realized why he was frozen there, because just a couple feet into the hole was, after more digging, turned out to be over 30 skeletons of cats, dogs, and other animals. This is when we started calling him Butcherface. Windows above my bed. Until very recently, I've slept in the room at the back of my house. It was a fairly small room, enough for a 10-year-old, but not enough for an 18-year-old. I had a TV, PlayStation, double bed pressed into the corner, and that was about it. So after years of begging, I convinced my mother to let me move my stuff into my little brother's shared room, and move their stuff into mine and a spare room, so everyone has their own. When I moved rooms, I went from the back of the house to the front. To get a better feel of it, imagine my house is just a line, with one long hallway through the middle with rooms on either side, one side facing the street and one facing our garden. In my new room, there are 3 windows, one long one facing onto the street, which I'd say is normal, and 2 windows facing the hallway, which I'd say is weird. I'm not sure when it started, but after a couple of weeks of sleeping in that room, I started waking up at night. Every night at 2:46 a.m., I would be woken up by something and casually drift back to sleep. I didn't think anything of it, really. Waking up in the night is hardly what anyone would call spooky. Last night, I woke up and looked at my phone to see the time, even though I already knew it, and a cold chill flooded me, and the hair stood up on my neck. Without thinking, I turned around and looked at the windows in the hallway. Looking back at me was a woman. Not my mother, because this woman was tall, taller than me, tall enough to have to stoop when walking through the hallway. Her face was long, too long, as though she'd been stretched. She stared into my eyes and I felt dread. Pure, horrifying dread. Her eyes were black pinpricks in an orb of milky white, and if I wasn't so terrified, I probably wouldn't have noticed her look at my door. Unthinking and completely reactionary, I dived at the door, holding it shut and locking it with the latch that I have on it. She pushed the door with some strength, and in some abstract part of my brain, I was disgusted that I could feel warm piss streaming down my leg and tears drenching my cheek. Then the force stopped and I heard a chuckle. A high-pitch, evil thing, but a chuckle nonetheless. I heard her open the door to my little brother's bedroom and then close it. I haven't left my room since last night and it smells disgusting. I can hear her moving around. She went from my brother's room to my parents' and then to my other brother's room. I haven't heard them all day. I realize that even though I've lived in this house almost all my life, it's not mine, it's hers. These windows were not so I could see her. They're for her to see me. Her chuckle is filling my waking hours. She's just letting me stew until I die or get crazy enough to try and run. It's nearly 2:46. She's still out there. I know she is. I can hear her pawing around, smashing plates and pushing things over. It doesn't seem to be in an aggressive way, but almost clumsily. I can't bring myself to move away from the door, in case through some horrible sense she notices and smashes in. I keep looking at my curtains, trying to think of a way to crash through the double-glazed windows to the road beyond and possible freedom. My family's been silent all day. I've lost hope that they're barricaded in their rooms like me, and on some disjointed part of my mind I'm wondering if there's any escape from this little piece of hell I've been forced into. My brain is screaming that this is all a dream, and I'll wake up soon, but I know that's not true. Even if I did, I doubt I'd even be sane. The sound of her footsteps on the panel wood flooring at the other end of the long hallway caught my interest, and without thinking, I opened my door and looked at her. I could only have looked for 3 or 4 seconds, but I drank it all in. Her lank, dead hair hanging to just below her shoulders that covered most of her face. Her emaciated body looked like she hadn't eaten in ever. She looked like a skeleton with not quite enough skin stretched around it. Standing at about 7.5 feet tall, she had to stoop so she didn't hit her head from the light fixtures. Then she turned. Her eyes creased in rage, and she screamed as she sprinted down the hallway at me, knocking pictures off the walls and bellowing with anger. I slam the door once more and pray to a God I don't even believe in that I'll be able to stop her from punching through the door and ripping me open. What felt like a decade later, she stopped pounding the door and giggled that horrible, disgusting sound that was like a nail in my soul. I couldn't move. I could feel her gaze in the side of my head, and it was paralyzing. I can't do this for much longer. I'm starving and dehydrated. I managed to force my sofa in front of the door, but I was too scared to move away from it, and just used it to help me keep her out of my room. It's a sanctuary to me. A horrible smell is starting to come from my little brother's room. He was only 6. I have to get out. I heard her exploring, and I had to take my chance at escape. I could probably break through the window if I threw my Xbox through it, so I waited until I heard footsteps at the other end of the hall and took my chance. I threw the Xbox with all my strength at the window, and I heard a smash and felt a gust, and the relief that spread through me was bottled up for later when I heard a screech from somewhere down the hall. I had opened the curtains by the time she got to my door. Not that it matters. She wasn't alone. Two almost exact replicas of the ghoul were staring at me from the hole in the window. That horrific giggle filled my ears from behind me, and I took a shallow breath as I turned to face this demon. I hope it ends with me, for your sake. Footsteps. I've never had to tell this story with enough detail to actually explain it all the way, but it is true, and it happened when I was about 6 years old. In a quiet room, if you press your ear against a pillow, you can hear your heartbeat. As a kid, the muffled, rhythmic beats sounded like soft footsteps on a carpeted floor. And so as a kid, almost every night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I would hear these footsteps, and I would be ripped back to consciousness, terrified. For my entire childhood, I lived with my mother in a fairly nice neighborhood that was in a transitional phase. People of lower economic means were gradually moving in, and my mother and I were two of these people. We lived in the kind of house you see being transported in two pieces on the interstate, but my mom took good care of it. There were a lot of woods surrounding the neighborhood that I would play in and explore during the day, but at night, as things often do to a kid, they took on a more sinister feeling. This coupled with the fact that, due to the nature of our house, there was a fairly large crawl space underneath, filled my mind with imaginary monsters and inescapable scenarios which would consume my thoughts when I was awoken by the footsteps. I told my mom about the footsteps, and she said that I was just imagining things. I persisted enough that she blasted my ears with water from a turkey baster once just to placate me, since I thought that would help. Of course it didn't. Despite all the creepiness and footsteps, the only weird thing that ever happened was that every now and then I would wake up on the bottom bunk, despite having gone to sleep on the top. But this wasn't really weird, since I'd sometimes get up to piss or get something to drink, and could remember just going back to sleep on the bottom bunk. I'm an only child, so it didn't matter. This would happen once or twice a week, but waking up on the bottom bunk wasn't too terrifying. But one night, I didn't wake up on the bottom bunk. I had heard the footsteps but was too far gone to be woken up by them, and when I was awoken, it wasn't from the sound of footsteps or a nightmare, but because I was cold. Really cold. When I opened my eyes, I saw stars. I was in the woods. I sat up immediately and tried to figure out what was going on. I thought I was dreaming, but that didn't seem right, though neither did me being in the woods. There was a deflated pool float right in front of me, one of those ones shaped like a shark. This only added to the surreal feeling, but after a while it seemed like I just wasn't going to wake up because I wasn't asleep. I stood up to orient myself, but I didn't recognize these woods. I played in the woods by my house all the time, and so I knew them really well, but if these weren't the same woods, then how could I get out? I took a step and felt a shooting pain in my foot, which knocked me back to where I had just been laying. I had stepped on a thorn. By the light of the moon, I could see that they were everywhere. I looked at my other foot, but it was fine, and as a matter of fact, so was the rest of me. I didn't have another scratch on me, and I wasn't even that dirty. I cried for a little bit, and then stood back up. I didn't know which way to go, so I just picked a direction. I resisted the urge to call out, since I wasn't sure I wanted to be found by who or what might be out there. I walked for what seemed like hours. I tried to walk in a straight line and tried to course correct when I had to take detours, but I was a kid and I was afraid. There weren't any howls or screams, and only once did I hear any noise that scared me. It sounded like a crying baby. I think now that it was just a cat, but I panicked. I ran, veering in different directions to avoid big thicks of bushes and collapsed trees, and I was paying close attention to where I stepped because by that point my feet were in pretty bad shape. I paid too much attention to where I was stepping and not enough to where those steps were leading, because not long after hearing the cry, I saw something that filled me with a kind of despair I haven't experienced since. It was the pool float. I was only 10 feet from where I had woken up. This wasn't magic or some supernatural space bending. I was lost. Up until that moment, I thought more about getting out of the woods than how I got in, but being back at the beginning caused my mind to swim. I wasn't even sure that these were my woods. I had only been hoping that they were. Had I run in a huge circle around that spot, or did I just get turned around and start making my way back? How was I going to get out? At the time, I thought the North Star was just the brightest star, and so I looked and found the brightest one and followed it. Eventually, things started to look more familiar, and when I saw the ditch, a dirt ditch my friends and I would have dirt-clawed wars in, I knew I had made it out. By that point, I was walking really slowly because my feet hurt so much. But I was so happy to be so close to home that I broke into a light jog. When I actually saw the roof of my house over a neighboring, lower-set house, I let out a light sob and ran faster. I just wanted to be home. I had already decided that I wouldn't say anything because I had no idea what I could possibly say. I would get back in the house somehow, clean up, and get in bed. My heart sunk as I rounded the corner and my house came fully into view. Every light in the house was on. I knew my mom was up, and I knew I would have to explain, or try to explain, where I had been, and I couldn't even figure out where to start. My run became a jog, which became a walk. I saw her silhouette through the blinds, and although I was worried about how to explain things to her that didn't matter to me at that point, I walked up the couple of steps to the porch and put my hand on the doorknob and turned. Right before I pushed it open, 2 arms wrapped around me and pulled me back. I screamed as loud as I could, "Mom, help me, please, Mom!" The feeling of being so close to being safe and then being physically pulled away from it filled me with a kind of dread that is, even after all these years, indescribable. The door I had been torn away from opened, and a flash of hope shot through my heart. But it wasn't my mom. It was a man, and he was enormous. I thrashed around and kicked at the shins of the person holding me while also trying to get away from the person who had just come out of my house. I was scared, but I was furious. "Let me go! Where is she? Where's my mom? What'd you do to her?" As my throat stung from screaming, and I was drawing in another breath, I became aware of a sound that had been present for longer than I had perceived it. "Honey, please calm down. I've got you." It sounded like my mom. The arms loosened and set me down, and as man approaching me blocked out the porch light, with his head I noticed his clothes. He was a cop. I turned to face the voice behind me and saw that it really was my mom. Everything was okay. I began to cry, and the 3 of us went inside. "I'm so glad you're home, sweetie. I was worried I'd never see you again." By that point, she was crying too. "I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. I just wanted to come home. I'm sorry." "It's okay. Just don't ever do that again. I'm not sure me or my shins could take it." A little laughter broke through my sobs, and I smiled a bit. "Well, I'm sorry for kicking you, but why'd you have to grab me like that?" "I was just afraid that you'd run away again." I was confused. "What do you mean?" "We found your note on your pillow," she said, and pointed at the piece of paper that the police officer was sliding across the table. I picked up the note and read it. It was a running away letter. It said that I was unhappy, never wanted to see her or any of my friends again. The police officer exchanged a few words with my mom on the porch while I stared at the letter. I didn't remember writing a letter. I didn't remember anything about any of this, but even if I sometimes went to the bathroom at night and didn't remember, or even if I could have gone into the woods on my own, even if all that could have been true, the only thing I knew at that point was, this isn't how you spell my name. I didn't write this letter. She found her way into my home. Please, I don't know what to do. I've tried to tell my wife about this, but she's a science teacher, and thanks to my history of practical jokes, she thinks I'm just kidding. There's something stalking me. I don't know what it wants, but almost every night since I started seeing it, It has terrorized me. It doesn't touch me. It doesn't communicate in any sort of way. It just fills me with horror. If what I seem to ramble, please forgive me. I haven't slept in several days. We live in the second floor of a duplex with stairs down the back of the house to the basement where the laundry machines are. There's a door at the bottom of the stairs before the door to the basement that looks out onto our back porch and into the backyard. 6 days ago, I was going down to the basement to bring up some laundry, and I glanced out the door as I passed. There was a figure standing at the far edge of our yard. Her back was to me, and she was just standing there, looking into the woods beyond our yard. She was dressed in nothing but a light gown. It had lots of flowing material coming off of it that was whipping around in the air slowly. The whole scene creeped me out instantly, but I thought she might be a friend of our downstairs neighbor, so I continued to the basement. When I came back up, she wasn't there. The next night I went down again, and as I passed the back door, I looked outside. The woman was back. She was exactly like she was the night before, facing away, not moving. The hair on my arms and neck stood up straight when I saw her. I was even more creeped out when I realized she was in the same clothes as the night before. That's when I did something I shouldn't have. I opened the back door. Leaning out, I called to her to see if she was okay. She didn't respond. She didn't make any sort of indication that she'd heard me. It was freezing cold, so I shut the door and locked it. Coming back upstairs afterward, I looked out the window and she was gone again. Later that same night, I was in the bedroom, getting ready to go to sleep. Everything was dark because my wife had gone to bed before me. Our bedroom looks out over the backyard, and my side of the bed faces the windows, so I have to go past them to get in. As I was doing so, I suddenly got that same deep dread feeling in my stomach that I had gotten the first time I saw the figure in the backyard. Something compelled me to hesitate by the windows. My hands were shaking as I pulled the curtain back a bit and peeked through the shades into the backyard. It was a clear night, so the backyard wasn't shrouded in darkness. The woman was standing in the middle of the backyard, no longer at the edge of the woods, facing the house with her head tilted up to look directly at the window I was peeking from. I jerked away instantly, afraid she had seen me. Her face was covered in shadow and hair, but I saw her chin and nose. A sharp nose and a thin chin. Gray. Her skin looks gray, I think. Her hair is black and long. I was so scared I jumped into bed and covered myself with the covers. The next day I played outside in the snow with my 4-year-old daughter. She wanted me to pull her on her sled in the backyard, but just the thought of going back there made me scared again, so I talked her into digging holes in the snow in the front yard. That night, things went from bad to worse. Somehow, I had managed to forget about the woman. Then, in the middle of the night, my daughter started crying. Our bedroom is just across the hall from hers. I thought she might need to use the bathroom or just be having a bad dream, so I went into her room to see if she was okay. She was uncovered, curled into a ball on her mattress. I pulled her covers over her, and that's when she whispered to me, "Daddy, there's someone in my closet." Instant goosebumps. I turned my head slowly toward the closet door at the end of her bed. Normally the closet is shut, but now it was open. The woman was standing in my daughter's closet. Not even when it was clear that I saw her did she move or make a sound, just stood there and looked at me through the cracked open door. My blood ran cold when I saw her. "Get up," I told my daughter. "Get in my arms, quickly, quickly." She scrambled up and hugged me tightly, and I walked backward out of the room, watching the closet the entire time. In my mind, I imagined her throwing the closet door open and running at us, arms outstretched. I just hugged my daughter and walked backward into my room. The woman never appeared in the doorway. I heard no movement from my daughter's room. I tucked her into my bed and stood there watching the doorway to her bedroom. I did not go back in. I just stood there and watched and listened. When I finally got the courage to climb into bed, I didn't sleep. Sunday, I told my wife everything. I told her about the first time I saw this woman. I told her about calling out to her and seeing her from the window. I told her that she had appeared in our daughter's closet. She told me it wasn't funny, that it was my fault for our daughter's bad dreams, and that I shouldn't encourage her to be afraid of her closet. Sunday night, my daughter called to me from her room again. Call me a coward, but I couldn't go back into that room. I called her quietly to come get in our bed, but she cried and said she was scared. I wanted to go and get her, but I was scared too. I told her to pull her blankets up and cover herself. Just cover yourself, honey, and you'll be okay. I prayed that it was true. I lay there, peeking over the sleeping form of my wife and out into the hallway at the closed door of my daughter's room, and just kept praying. I heard her cry a while longer, then she went quiet, and I hoped that she was asleep. Monday, I piled toys in front of the door to her closet. By that time, there was no doubt in my mind that this was some sort of ghost or apparition, but I piled things in front of the closet anyway, like a pile of toys could stop a ghost. Monday night, my daughter did not cry, but I didn't sleep. I lay there, looking at the ceiling, tense. Around 2 o'clock, I heard her bedroom door creak open, and I knew something was wrong. She must be scared, I thought, so I called to her like before. Just come to me, and you can sleep in our bed, sweetie. But she didn't come. I peeked over my wife. The woman was standing there in the doorway to my daughter's room. Her arms hung at her sides, her shoulders slouched down. Her gown was dirty, like it hadn't been washed in years, and hung off her likes torn rags. I wasn't breathing. I wasn't blinking. I just looked at her, and she looked at me, and I thought, this is it. I'm going to die. She never moved, never made a sound. I whispered, please, go away. Please, leave me alone. Please, I'm sorry. I couldn't look away. If I look away, she will get closer. I was sure of it. If I close my eyes, when I open them, she'll be standing over me, looking at me. At some point, she was gone. It's like I fell asleep with my eyes open. I don't remember her disappearing, just that I was looking at the doorway and she wasn't there anymore. Last night, I lay awake, waiting. I asked my wife to shut our bedroom door because the night light in the hallway was keeping me awake. It was stupid. I don't know what I was thinking. Like clockwork, I heard my daughter's bedroom door creak open. I held my breath. Then I heard the floorboards in the hallway creaking, and I started shaking uncontrollably. I heard our bedroom door open, and I knew she was standing there, in the doorway, not moving, just looking at me. I didn't look. I couldn't. I did what had I told my daughter to do, and pulled the covers over my head. I am a complete mess, a zombie at work. I don't want to go home anymore. I think I see the woman in other places, a glance while driving, and I think she's sitting in the passenger seat of the truck behind me, or standing down the street as I drive off. Just sitting here at my desk, someone passes by behind me, and I jump. I'm afraid that if I turn around, she'll be there, waiting for me to look at her. And what if I saw her face? I don't want to see it. I don't want to see her anymore, but I don't know what to do. The only hope I feel is that, for unrelated reasons, my wife is talking about moving, but our lease isn't up until May. I don't know if I can hold out that long. Buttonhead. Back in the late 80s, I worked for a U.S. Department of Energy laboratory in the American Southwest. A set of sprawling cities within cities, the DOE lab complex employs thousands of people, with work ranging from computer science, physics, and chemistry, all the way to important infrastructure jobs like construction or security. I worked on mainframes at the time. Like any secure government facility, this particular complex had a set of colorful, local legends that over-dramatized the mysterious work we performed. People were convinced that the labs held evidence that aliens had visited us in the 50s, or that we developed a neutron bomb capable of wiping out cities without destroying any buildings, or that we were sitting on cold fusion technology, but were keeping it a secret to protect the interests of big oil. These are all completely false. In reality, the labs were run much like any other company. We had time cards, deadlines, department meetings, and boss's day lunches just like everybody else, despite, or perhaps because of, the reality of mundane lab work. Staff often got a kick out of perpetuating these myths. While on a lunch break, I was once asked if I'd ever been to the flying saucer hangar. "Which one?" I replied. "We've got our own fleet." More interesting, and often much more dark, were the stories that circulated between scientists and lab staff within the walls of the complex. One such rumor posited that physicists had briefly made contact with humans from the distant future, and that the transmission was IBD, interesting but disturbing. Another popular rumor held that we'd created a biological agent so virulent that the labs had been forced to quarantine an entire building, raze it to the ground, and bury the rubble in the desert, along with its deceased inhabitants. My favorite story, Buttonhead is watching you. In those days, the halls of every building were plastered with information security awareness posters, usually featuring a red-faced villain wearing a trench coat. Beware of your adversary, protect your secrets. The enemy is always watching. Always dispose of sensitive documents in a burn bag. It's likely that Buttonhead was a mishmash of popular alien myths and the pervasive atmosphere of Cold War paranoia, and embodied the idea of an insider threat. The Buttonhead legend went something like this: when working late at night, be on the watch for Buttonhead, who prowls the laboratory halls after sundown. He can only get you when you're alone. He doesn't have a mouth to speak or ears to hear, but his eyes do more than see, and he's always watching. According to witnesses, Buttonhead looked like a person from far away, but had a featureless, roundish head with a pair of deep holes in the center of his face. Nobody ever said what Buttonhead was watching for or what he would do if he ever caught you alone. It was typically the older lab veterans who would bring up Buttonhead, along with hush stories about the mysterious disappearance of several Night Owl employees over the years. During a retirement party, I jokingly asked the guest of honor if he'd ever seen Buttonhead. "I saw it once in one of the old warehouses way south of the tech area," he replied, cracking a forced smile. "I remember the smell, most of all." "So is he an alien, or just a regular old ghost?" The smile quickly drained away. He paused, looking like he might confess something important, but stopped short of it, muttering, "No, it's much worse than that." A few months later, I was pulling a late night in one of our mainframe rooms, performing some maintenance work with a co-worker, a contractor named Gary. Gary, a bald, pudgy, diabetic Mormon, was a salt-of-the-earth type with an easygoing demeanor. He had an abbreviated sense of humor, but didn't have a mean bone in his body, and was a good colleague. The mainframe room was in the largest single-story building in the complex, with around 20 crisscrossing halls that seemed to stretch onto infinity. After working hours, most of these halls would fall pitch dark. Hall D, our mainframe hall, was still lit, but every other hall was a catacomb tunnel, with only the faint glow of the occasional vending machine to illuminate the faraway corners of the building. The mainframe computer room itself was large, but was stuffed with IBM System/37Os and noisy fridge-sized cooling units. It wasn't feng shui or anything, but we loved playing around with computers so much that we didn't mind. At around 9 or 10 that night, Gary left the room for a bio break, leaving me alone at my terminal. 30 minutes later, the lights flickered off. This was a frequent occurrence in the aging building, which was why we armed ourselves with flashlights for the late shifts. I noticed that Gary hadn't returned from the men's room, and as I felt the call of nature myself, I grabbed my ever-ready and headed out the door to check things out. That's when I first noticed the smell. I tell folks that it smelled like mint gum and roach poison, but there was an indescribable and subtle sickness to it. I've never smelled anything like it since. It was the scent of something horribly unclean and unnatural, combined with a potent, artificial sweetness. I left mainframe room and hurried toward the men's room, which was 2 darkened hallways over. I made it 5 paces when I saw him, or it, or whatever it was, standing in front of the exit doors at the far end of Hall D, was what looked like a man wearing a gray jumpsuit. Both it and I remained motionless as I trained my light down the hall. Seconds later, it broke into a speed walk straight for me. It was still a few hundred feet away, but I could tell something was clearly wrong by the way it walked. It had an impossibly fast gait, like people from old newsreel clips, and by its head, which looked like an enlarged, lumpy orb. When its face came into view, I sprinted back into the mainframe room, which thankfully had a mechanical push-button lock. The face was utterly unrecognizable. It was just a scattered set of abscesses and holes. After slamming the door shut and backing toward the desks, a figure appeared in the small frosted safety window. It was quiet for a moment, and then it spoke. "It's Gary. Let me in. I just saw something." I couldn't hear it perfectly over the drone of the fans, but something wasn't right about the voice. It sounded like Gary, but as if he were leading some sort of spoken word chant with dozens of other voices. It instantly dawned on me that Gary knew the lock combination. I was paralyzed with fear and didn't respond. At this point, the smell was so strong that it almost hurt to breathe. It spoke again. "It's Gary. Let me in. I just saw something." It sounded like an identical recording of what I'd heard seconds ago. My heart sunk when I realized that there weren't any other exits to the room. I backed up toward the machines, quietly hoping that the thing would go away and that the lights would come back on. A deep, buzzing sound came from the other side of the door, followed by more words from the thing in the hall. "Hello? Honey?" The voice had the muffled pitch of a telephone receiver, but it was clearly my wife. It sounded like she was at home. "Han, is that you? Is everything okay?" I was in a state of confusion, despair, and shock. I summoned the courage to approach the door, aiming my light through the window. "The police have been notified," I yelled. This was impossible, as the mainframe room wasn't technically office space, and thus had no phone. I heard something that sounded like liquid being pulled up through a novelty straw, and then a splattering sound. A thick white fluid slowly spilled out onto the vinyl tile from underneath the door. The smell was nearly unbearable. I began yelling for help. I could hear the thing fumbling with the push-button lock. The splattering continued, and the dense white syrup kept pouring in from beneath the door. I remember retreating to the back corner of the mainframe room, and then nothing else. Hours later, a pair of MPs found me curled up in a ball and sopping wet in the rear corner of the mainframe room. My wife, who had received a call at 10:30 from someone she believed to be me, called the base police at midnight after I didn't return home. The guards didn't find any sign of forced entry, and there was no sign of Gary or the white liquid. The next morning, my manager told me that Gary had terminated his contract earlier that week and wasn't even scheduled to come in that day. I never saw him again. My wife and I moved to California a month later. Even though I work from home these days, my pulse still quickens when I walk down a darkened hallway. What stays with me the most is that strange, awful smell. It's probably just my brain playing tricks, but I swear it still wafts in through my windows some nights.